Have you ever wondered what it was like to live in a world where the threat of nuclear war was a daily reality? Imagine a world divided, two superpowers locked in a tense standoff, each with their fingers hovering over the button that could obliterate life as we know it. This was the stage set by the Cold War, a geopolitical chess game played by the United States and the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of World War II, the world was carved into two distinct spheres of influence. On one side, the United States, the champion of capitalism, a system promoting free markets and individual liberties. On the other side, the Soviet Union, a bastion of communism, advocating for state control and equality among its citizens. These ideological differences ignited a conflict that was far from typical. Instead of armies clashing on battlefields, this war was fought in the shadows, in the corridors of power, and in the minds of people across the globe. It was a war of propaganda, espionage, and political maneuvering. However, the most terrifying aspect of this conflict was the looming threat of nuclear war. Both superpowers amassed arsenals capable of eradicating life on Earth multiple times over. They were locked in a deadly embrace, each knowing that any direct confrontation would lead to mutual destruction. This grim reality was known as mutually assured destruction, a concept that, ironically, prevented the Cold War from turning hot. Imagine living under the constant pressure of this reality, the knowledge that at any moment your world could be turned to ashes. A child practicing duck and cover drills at school. A politician navigating the treacherous waters of international diplomacy. A spy risking their life to provide vital information. This was the reality of the Cold War, a period of global tension and rivalries that lasted for nearly half a century. This was a time when the world held its breath, hoping that cooler heads would prevail, and that the dawn of a new day wouldn't bring with it the flash of nuclear annihilation. The seeds of the Cold War were sown in the ruins of World War II. As the world emerged from the devastation of the Second World War, two superpowers emerged, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But instead of a united front against future threats, what emerged was a deep-seated mistrust, an ideological difference that would shape the world for the next half-century. The end of World War II saw the victorious Allies gathered at Yalta and Potsdam, their aim to shape a post-war peace that represented a collective security order. But as they sat across the table, it became clear that their visions for the future were not aligned. The United States, under the leadership of President Franklin Roosevelt, and later Harry Truman, was keen on spreading democracy and free market capitalism. The USSR, led by Joseph Stalin, was equally determined to expand communism and Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. Germany, the aggressor of the war, was divided into 4 zones of occupation, each controlled by one of the Allies: the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, the capital, despite being deep within the Soviet zone, was also divided similarly. This division of Germany and Berlin was a physical manifestation of the ideological divide that was setting in. As the months passed, the differences deepened. The Soviets blocked access to West Berlin, leading to the famous Berlin Airlift, where the Western Allies supplied the city by air for nearly a year. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, launched the Marshall Plan, aiming to rebuild war-torn Europe under a capitalist model. The ideological chasm between the two superpowers only grew wider. The world watched as alliances were formed, nations were divided, and an arms race began. The term Cold War was coined to describe this state of political hostility, where there was no direct military conflict but a constant threat of nuclear war loomed large. Thus began an era of intense rivalry and competition between the two superpowers. The Cold War was marked by numerous crises and confrontations. This period of geopolitical tension, stretching from the close of the Second World War in 1945 to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, was punctuated by several major events that heightened the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Our journey through the significant episodes of the Cold War begins with the Korean War. In 1950, North Korea, backed by China and the USSR, invaded South Korea, which was supported by the United States and its allies. This was an early example of proxy wars, where the superpowers would support opposing sides in other nations' conflicts, rather than directly engaging each other. Next, we turn our gaze to the Caribbean. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This 13-day standoff between the USA and USSR is considered the closest the world has ever come to nuclear conflict, and it dramatically underscored the perils of this Cold War rivalry. Continuing our journey, we land in Southeast Asia, where the Vietnam War raged from 1955 to 1975. The United States intervened to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam, resulting in a protracted and highly controversial conflict that further stoked Cold War tensions. Last but not least, we look to the stars. The space race, spanning from 1955 to 1972, saw the USA and USSR competing for supremacy in spaceflight capability. It was a race of technology and ideology, culminating in the United States Apollo moon landing in 1969. These events were not just battles on their own, but pieces of a larger puzzle, a global power struggle between the USA and USSR. Each confrontation, each crisis, each war, and each race were chapters in a story of two superpowers vying for global influence and dominance during the tense decades of the Cold War. Every conflict has an end, and the Cold War was no exception. The final act of the Cold War was not a grand showdown of military might, but rather a series of internal struggles within the Soviet Union. The USSR was grappling with a sluggish economy, unable to keep pace with the technological advancements and economic prosperity of the West. The economic disparity became glaringly apparent to the Soviet people, sparking discontent and demands for change. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev, a charismatic leader who had risen through the ranks of the Soviet political system. He assumed the role of General Secretary in 1985, and his leadership would prove instrumental in bringing the Cold War to an end. Gorbachev recognized the need for reform, and he introduced two significant policies: glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. Glasnost aimed to increase transparency and freedom of speech in the Soviet Union. It led to an open discussion about the country's problems, which had been previously swept under the rug. On the other hand, perestroika was a bold attempt to reform the Soviet economic system, moving away from strict government control and towards a more market-oriented approach. While these reforms were well-intentioned, they inadvertently hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union. The newfound freedom of speech led to a surge in nationalist movements and calls for independence among the Soviet republics. The physical symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, fell in 1989. This momentous event symbolized the end of Soviet influence over Eastern Europe. 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, marking the official end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was a pivotal moment in world history. It marked the dissolution of the bipolar world order and the beginning of the United States' reign as the world's sole superpower. The Cold War ended not with a bang but with a whimper, signaling the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Cold War may be over, but its impact is still felt today. The legacy of the Cold War is far-reaching, influencing numerous aspects of our world. In the realm of international relations, the Cold War's bipolar world order, where two superpowers dominated, has transformed into a more multipolar world. Yet the United States and Russia's strained relations, a residue from the Cold War, persist and continue to shape global politics. The Cold War's political legacy also remains profound. The ideological battle between capitalism and communism birthed a generation of leaders and nations who still grapple with these ideologies. The democratic freedoms championed by the West and the socialist principles upheld by the East continue to inform political debates and policy decisions around the globe. In the cultural sphere, the Cold War birthed a plethora of art, literature, and film, reflecting the anxieties and hopes of the era. The spy novels, apocalyptic films, and pop culture icons of the period continue to captivate audiences, offering a window into the tensions and fears of the time. The Cold War's technological legacy is equally fascinating. The space race, a symbol of the superpowers' rivalry, sparked significant advancements in science and technology. The desire to conquer the final frontier led to the birth of satellite technology, which now underpins our digital world, from GPS navigation to weather forecasting and telecommunications. Perhaps most importantly, the Cold War shaped the modern world's political landscape. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to the emergence of new nations, reshaping the world map. Simultaneously, the end of the war marked a shift in power dynamics, with the United States emerging as the world's sole superpower. This new world order has shaped and continues to influence global politics and international relations. The Cold War era might be a thing of the past, but its echoes continue to reverberate in our present world. The lessons learned during this period of history remain crucial in understanding our world today and navigating our future. So, we've journeyed through the tense and tumultuous era of the Cold War. We've witnessed the beginning, the major events, the end, and the lingering legacy. This era has shaped our world in ways that continue to resonate. Unearth the deeper intricacies of this period, feel its reverberations, and understand its implications. Remember to hit that like button if you enjoyed this journey through history, leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more exciting historical content. Until next time, keep exploring history.